Welcome to one of the most bone-chilling tales from the lawless frontier, where a simple promise to pay for lodging became a nightmare that would haunt the Wild West for decades. Before we dive into this terrifying account, drop a comment below telling me what time you're watching this and whether you're brave enough to listen alone. I'm curious how many of you dare experience this story in complete darkness. In the harsh winter of 1874, along the desolate stretch of trail between Dodge City and Denver, stood the most feared establishment in all of Kansas Territory. The Crossroads Inn wasn't just a place where weary travelers could rest their heads. It was a trap where desperate souls discovered that some debts can only be paid in blood, flesh, and screaming terror. This is the true story of what happened to those unfortunate enough to knock on Silas Grimm's door when their pockets were empty, but their bodies were still warm. What you're about to hear will make you think twice about ever trusting a stranger's hospitality again. The year 1874 was brutal for anyone trying to make their way across the Kansas plains. The great cattle drives that had made fortunes just a few years earlier were starting to dry up as railroads pushed deeper into Texas. Freight wagons that once carried goods between frontier towns were being replaced by iron horses that never got tired, never needed rest, and never asked for wages. Honest work was harder to find than water in a drought. Desperate men were taking desperate chances, riding hundreds of miles on rumors of work that might not even exist when they got there. The lonesome trail between the big cities became a hunting ground for predators who knew exactly how to spot easy prey. Men whose clothes were wearing thin, whose horses were getting skinny, and whose eyes held that hollow look of folks who hadn't eaten a decent meal in days. That's where Silas Grimm built his inn, right at the crossroads where three major trails met, about 60 miles from anywhere that mattered. Smart location for catching travelers who were too tired to be suspicious and too hungry to ask the right questions, but far enough from civilization that screams wouldn't carry to the wrong ears. The location wasn't chosen by accident. Grimm had studied the patterns of frontier travel for months before selecting this particular spot. He knew that men traveling between Denver and Dodge City would need to stop somewhere around this point for rest and supplies. He also knew that many of them would be running low on money by the time they reached his door. Local freight haulers who knew the trail well had tried to warn travelers about the Crossroads Inn, but their warnings were often dismissed as superstition or jealousy. After all, what harm could there be in a well-lit inn that offered hot meals and clean beds at reasonable prices? Grimm himself was the kind of man mothers warned their children about in bedtime stories, tall as a scarecrow and twice as menacing, with pale skin that never seemed to see sunlight and eyes like chips of black ice. His hands were too big for his body, with long fingers that moved like spider legs when he talked. When he smiled, which he did often, his teeth were perfectly white and perfectly straight, too perfect for a man living on the frontier. Local folks said he'd shown up one day in 1871, paid cash for the land, and built his inn with his own two hands. Never said where he came from, never talked about his past, and never seemed to age a single day no matter how much time passed. Some said he'd been a doctor back east before coming west, which would explain his knowledge of anatomy. Others whispered that he'd learned his skills in places no Christian man should ever go. The inn itself looked normal enough from the outside. 2 stories of rough timber with a wide porch, and oil lamps burning in every window. But there was something wrong with the place that made horses nervous and dogs whine. Smart animals could sense evil, and they wanted nothing to do with whatever lived inside those walls. The building seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it, and even on the hottest summer days, a chill hung around the property like morning fog that never burned off. Travelers approaching the inn often reported feeling watched, though they could never spot anyone at the windows. The feeling of being studied like a piece of meat in a butcher shop. Dr. Edmund Walsh, who rode the circuit between frontier towns providing medical care, wrote detailed notes about his experience at the Crossroads Inn in 1873. His account gives us our first real glimpse into what made this place so terrifying, and why smart travelers learned to give it a wide berth. I arrived at the establishment just as darkness was falling, Dr. Walsh wrote in his journal. The proprietor, one Silas Grimm, greeted me on the porch as if he'd been expecting my arrival, though I had sent no word ahead. His handshake was cold as January creek water, and his smile never reached those black pit eyes that seemed to look right through me. The doctor's medical training made him observant of details others might miss, The common room appeared clean and well-maintained, but I noticed odd stains on the wooden floor that seemed to have been scrubbed over repeatedly without success. Dark patches that suggested something had been spilled there many times, something that didn't want to come clean no matter how hard you scrubbed. Dr. Walsh's journal reveals his growing unease as the evening progressed. Most troubling were the sounds I heard throughout the night, not the normal creaking of settling timber, but rhythmic scraping from somewhere below the floorboards, punctuated by what could only be described as muffled sobbing. When I inquired about these sounds at breakfast, Mr. Grimm assured me they were merely rats in the cellar, though his explanation felt as hollow as a dead tree. The physician's trained eye caught details that would have escaped most travelers. At breakfast I observed that while Mr. Grimm served a substantial meal of eggs, bacon, and fresh bread, he consumed nothing himself. When I commented on his lack of appetite, he replied that he fed differently than most folks, and left it at that. Something in his tone made me decide not to press the matter further. Dr. Walsh's account becomes more disturbing as he describes the other guests at the inn. There were 3 other men staying the night: a cattle buyer heading to Colorado, a freight hauler whose wagon had broken down, and a young man who claimed to be traveling to Denver to find work. All 3 men seemed healthy and well-fed when I saw them at dinner, but by morning, only the cattle buyer remained. The doctor's medical knowledge made him suspicious of the explanation he was given. When I asked about the missing guests, Grimm explained that they had departed early to take advantage of the cool morning air, but their horses remained in the stable, and their belongings were still in their rooms. No man travels the frontier on foot by choice, especially not without his gear. Dr. Walsh's journal entry continues with observations that proved prophetic. As I prepared to leave, Mr. Grimm inquired about my travel plans and whether anyone expected my arrival at a specific time. His questions seemed overly detailed for mere courtesy, and I found myself lying about my destination and schedule. Some instinct warned me that the truth might prove dangerous in his hands. The doctor's final observation would haunt him for years to come. As I rode away, I noticed fresh earth behind the inn that suggested recent digging, though no crops or garden were evident. The disturbed ground was arranged in rectangular plots of uniform size, approximately 6 feet in length and 3 feet in width. I urged my horse to greater speed and did not look back, though I felt eyes watching me until I was well out of sight. Dr. Walsh's journal provides crucial early evidence of the sinister activities at the Crossroads Inn, but it would be months before anyone connected the dots between his observations and the growing number of missing travelers in the region. The inn's location made it the perfect trap for men who found themselves caught between destinations, with empty pockets and nowhere else to turn. The pattern Grimm followed was always the same, refined through months of practice until it became a deadly routine. Travelers would arrive at the inn seeking shelter, usually just as darkness was falling, and they were too tired to continue their journey. Those who could pay for their rooms received normal service and were sent on their way in the morning, often with recommendations for their next stop. But for travelers who arrived with empty pockets and desperate eyes, Grimm had a special welcome. He would listen to their sob stories with apparent sympathy, nodding at all the right moments and making understanding noises as they explained their circumstances. Then, when they finished their tale of woe, he would flash that cold smile and make his terrible offer. "Don't you worry about payment," he would say, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "I'm sure we can work something out. A man with strong arms and a willing spirit can always find ways to settle his debts. You'll pay with more than money, but I guarantee you'll find the arrangement satisfactory." Most desperate men heard what they wanted to hear: the promise of work to pay off their debt, maybe some odd jobs around the inn that would earn them a hot meal and a warm bed. They never stopped to wonder why Grimm's smile looked more like a wolf sizing up a sheep, or why his eyes gleamed with anticipation when he made his offer. Marcus Thompson was one of the few men who lived to tell about Grimm's proposition and what it really meant. A former cavalry soldier trying to make his way to California after his discharge, Thompson arrived at the inn in late 1873 with nothing but the clothes on his back, a worn-out horse, and a belly that hadn't seen proper food in 4 days. "I'd been riding hard for a week, trying to stay ahead of an early blizzard that was tracking me across Kansas," Thompson later told territorial authorities. "When I saw those oil lamps burning like beacons in the darkness, it felt like divine intervention. The innkeeper was waiting on the porch as if he'd been expecting me. though I'd made no reservation and told nobody my travel plans. Thompson's military experience had taught him to be suspicious of coincidences, but hunger and exhaustion can cloud even a soldier's judgment. When I explained my situation, that I was broke but desperate for shelter, his whole demeanor changed. The fake courtesy dropped away like a mask, and something predatory took its place. He looked at me the way a butcher looks at a side of beef. The former cavalry trooper's testimony reveals the calculated nature of Grimm's approach. He looked me up and down like a rancher evaluating livestock, paying particular attention to my physical condition and the calluses on my hands. Asked about my health, whether I'd been sick recently, if I had any family expecting me in California. Questions that seemed friendly enough on the surface but felt wrong somehow. Thompson's military training made him suspicious of offers that seemed too good to be true. When he made his proposition about working off the debt, something about the way he said "special projects" made my skin crawl. But I was desperate enough to consider anything that didn't involve breaking the law. He assured me the work was perfectly legal, just labor that required discretion, due to the sensitive nature of his business operations. The soldier's account reveals how Grimm used desperation to cloud his victim's judgment. I asked for details about the work, but he said those would be explained after I'd committed to staying. Said it was the kind of opportunity that didn't come along often, and he needed men who could keep their mouths shut about what they saw. Thompson describes the room Grimm showed him as comfortable, but somehow wrong. Clean sheets, warm blankets, and a window that looked out over the prairie. But the window had bars on the inside, disguised as decorative ironwork. When I asked about them, Grimm said they were to keep wild animals from breaking the glass. Seemed reasonable enough at the time. The soldier's testimony becomes more chilling as he describes his first night at the inn. I woke around midnight to the sound of digging from somewhere below my room. The scraping of shovels against earth was unmistakable, mixed with voices too low to make out words. But there was something else. Sounds that reminded me of battlefield surgeries I'd witnessed during the war. Thompson's military experience had exposed him to sights and sounds that would have driven ordinary men mad, but what he heard that night was different. I'd heard men dying on battlefields, heard the sounds of field surgeons working by lantern light to save wounded soldiers, but this was something else, more methodical, more deliberate, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had done it many times before. The former cavalry soldier's instincts told him he was in mortal danger. I'd learned to trust my gut during the war, and every instinct was screaming at me to get out of that place immediately. But when I tried the door, I discovered it was locked from the outside. The decorative ironwork on the window was solid steel, and the glass was too thick to break without making noise that would bring Grimm running. Thompson's escape attempt reveals more about the inn's sinister purpose and Grimm's preparation for keeping unwilling guests. I managed to pry up some loose floorboards near the wall. Cavalry training includes basic demolition skills. The space beneath my room connected to a cellar system that I realized had been designed for purposes that had nothing to do with storing food or supplies. The former soldier's description of what he found in that underground maze was so disturbing that territorial authorities initially refused to believe it. The cellar had been divided into chambers connected by narrow passages. Some rooms contained workbenches with tools that belonged in a butcher shop rather than an inn. Others held large vats filled with chemicals that burned the nostrils and made the eyes water. Thompson's military medical training, basic though it was, helped him understand what he was seeing. During the war, I'd helped field surgeons with amputations and other procedures. I recognized some of the instruments, but others were designed for purposes I didn't want to think about. Everything was clean and well organized, like a surgeon's operating theater. The soldier's testimony about the final chamber he discovered provides crucial evidence about the fate of previous guests. Metal tables stained with substances I didn't want to identify, restraints designed to hold a human body motionless, and surgical instruments that had obviously seen recent use. The smell in that room was something I'd encountered on battlefields, the smell of death and chemicals used to preserve specimens. Thompson describes finding evidence that revealed the true scope of Grimm's operation. On shelves along the walls were glass jars containing specimens that had once been parts of human beings. Hearts, livers, other organs floating in preserving fluid. Each jar was labeled with dates and what looked like customer codes. The former cavalry soldier's discovery of Grimm's records provided crucial evidence about the systematic nature of his crimes. I found ledger books documenting dozens of previous guests, with detailed notes about their physical characteristics, health conditions, and the specific uses their bodies had been put to after their deaths. Grimm wasn't just killing travelers, he was harvesting them like cattle. Thompson's testimony reveals the commercial nature of Grimm's operation. The records showed regular correspondence with clients in Denver, Kansas City, St. Louis, and other cities, orders for specific organs and tissues, with prices that made it clear this was a profitable business. Human body parts were apparently in high demand among certain buyers. The soldier's description of Grimm's preservation methods shows the systematic efficiency of the operation. He had developed techniques for keeping organs fresh during transport, using ice and chemical preservatives to maintain quality during long-distance shipping. Everything was documented with the precision of a legitimate business operation. Thompson's escape was only possible because his military training had prepared him for exactly this kind of situation. Cavalry scouts learned to move quietly through enemy territory, and the cellar passages were just another kind of hostile environment. I'd learned to pick locks during reconnaissance missions behind Confederate lines, and the cellar door wasn't designed to keep out someone with proper skills. The former soldier's description of his escape reveals more about the inn's defenses. Getting out of the building was only the beginning. I still had to cross 60 miles of open prairie with a madman who knew the territory better than I did. Grimm had prepared for the possibility of escaping guests, and he was ready to hunt me down. Thompson's harrowing flight from the inn provides insight into Grimm's hunting methods and the resources at his disposal. I hadn't gone 10 miles before I heard hoofbeats behind me. Grimm was coming after me personally, and he'd brought help, men whose laughter carried across the prairie like the howling of wolves. They weren't just tracking me, they were enjoying the hunt. The chase that followed lasted 3 days and revealed the extent of Grimm's preparation for dealing with escapees. They knew the country too well for me to outrun them directly, so I had to be smarter. Used every trick I'd learned about moving through hostile territory, doubled back on my own trail, hid in creek beds during daylight, traveled at night when possible. Thompson describes the systematic way his pursuers attempted to drive him into traps. They weren't trying to catch me immediately. They were herding me toward specific locations where escape would be impossible. Box canyons, dead-end arroyos, places where they could corner me and take me alive. They wanted me back at the inn, not dead on the prairie. The former cavalry soldier's survival depended on tactics he'd learned fighting Confederate guerrillas. I'd chased Confederate raiders through similar country during the war, and I knew their tricks. Problem was, Grimm and his men seemed to know the same tricks, and had local knowledge I lacked. They were forcing me to make choices between bad options and worse ones. Thompson's eventual escape was only possible because he encountered a cavalry patrol that had been sent to investigate reports of missing travelers in the region. I was more dead than alive when Sergeant Miller found me hiding in a buffalo wallow, speaking in whispers about monsters that wore human faces. Lucky for me, Miller had served in the same theater during the war and recognized genuine combat stress when he saw it. The cavalry patrol's initial skepticism changed when they examined Thompson's condition and heard his detailed account of what he'd discovered at the Crossroads Inn. Sergeant Miller had seen enough action to know when a man was telling the truth about horrors he'd witnessed. My description of the cellar chambers and the surgical equipment was too detailed and too consistent to be the product of a fevered imagination. The cavalry investigation that followed Thompson's report uncovered evidence that shocked even hardened frontier soldiers who had seen their share of violence and depravity. Captain William Hayes, who led the investigation, filed reports that were immediately classified by territorial authorities who deemed the contents too disturbing for public knowledge. Captain Hayes's classified report, not released until the 1920s, reveals the full extent of Grimm's operation and its implications for frontier safety. The Crossroads Inn served as the center of a commercial enterprise that exploited the desperate circumstances of frontier travel to acquire human subjects for purposes that exceeded the boundaries of civilized understanding. The captain's investigation revealed evidence of systematic planning and preparation that went far beyond simple murder. The inn's design and construction had been specifically planned to facilitate the capture, processing, and disposal of human victims. Every aspect of the operation, from the selection of the location to the arrangement of the underground chambers demonstrated careful forethought and criminal expertise. Hayes's report documents the sophisticated methods Grimm had developed for identifying suitable victims. Evidence recovered from the premises indicates that travelers were evaluated according to specific criteria, including physical condition, apparent wealth, travel circumstances, and likelihood that their disappearance would prompt investigation. Those who met Grimm's requirements were systematically eliminated and processed. The investigation revealed that Grimm's operation had been active for at least 3 years before Thompson's escape led to its discovery. Based on recovered documentation and physical evidence, we estimate that approximately 47 individuals were processed through the facility's underground chambers. The victims were selected primarily from the population of traveling men who lacked family connections or predetermined schedules that would make their disappearance immediately noticeable. Captain Hayes's report includes disturbing details about the systematic nature of Grimm's crimes. The recovered records demonstrate business-like efficiency in the selection, processing, and distribution of human biological materials. Victims were cataloged according to their physical characteristics and the commercial value of their organs and tissues. The investigation revealed that Grimm had developed an extensive network of clients who purchased his products. Correspondence found at the site indicates regular business relationships with individuals in major cities throughout the region. These clients included medical colleges, private physicians, and researchers who required human specimens for their work. Hayes documented the sophisticated preservation and shipping methods Grimm had developed. The cellar facilities included equipment for chemical preservation of biological specimens and specialized containers for maintaining quality during long-distance transport. The operation demonstrated knowledge of anatomy and chemistry that suggested either medical training or consultation with educated accomplices. The captain's report reveals the extent to which Grimm had prepared for the possibility of discovery. When our patrol arrived at the inn to arrest the proprietor, we initially found the building apparently abandoned. However, further investigation revealed that this abandonment was an elaborate deception designed to provide time for destroying evidence and escaping custody. The actual capture of Silas Grimm proved more challenging than the cavalry patrol had anticipated. A thorough search of the premises revealed a concealed chamber beneath the main cellar, accessed through a hidden panel that required specific knowledge to locate and operate. Grimm was discovered hiding in this chamber, along with additional evidence of his criminal activities. Captain Hayes describes the hidden chamber as containing supplies that would have enabled Grimm to remain concealed for weeks or months if necessary. The concealed space contained food, water, medical supplies, and additional documentation that had been kept separate from the main records. This material revealed that Grimm's operation was part of a larger network of similar enterprises operating throughout the frontier region. The prisoner's psychological evaluation revealed characteristics that set him apart from typical frontier criminals. During interrogation, Grimm displayed no remorse for his actions and spoke of his victims as inventory that had been processed according to business necessity. His complete lack of empathy and his matter-of-fact description of systematic murder suggested psychological abnormalities that exceeded normal criminal behavior. Dr. Walsh, who had narrowly escaped becoming one of Grimm's victims, was called upon to evaluate the prisoner's mental condition. During my examination of the defendant, he spoke freely about his methods and motivations, displaying pride in the efficiency of his operation, and expressing regret only that circumstances had forced him to abandon what he described as a profitable and beneficial enterprise. The physician's evaluation revealed Grimm's complete inability to understand normal moral and social boundaries. Throughout our conversations, he expressed genuine puzzlement at society's negative reaction to his work, claiming that he had provided valuable services to clients who appreciated quality biological materials. His inability to recognize the moral implications of systematic murder suggested profound psychological abnormalities. Dr. Walsh's examination also revealed Grimm's apparent lack of normal human emotional responses. The defendant displayed no anxiety about his legal situation, no concern for the suffering of his victims, and no regret for the lives he had taken. His emotional flatness was so complete that I questioned whether he possessed the same psychological makeup as normal human beings. The legal proceedings that followed Grimm's capture were complicated by questions about his mental competency and the unprecedented nature of his crimes. Territorial courts had limited experience with cases involving systematic murder for commercial purposes, creating procedural challenges that would influence the development of frontier legal systems. Judge Samuel Crawford, who presided over the proceedings, noted that Grimm's case raised fundamental questions about criminal motivation and the appropriate legal response to crimes that exceeded normal patterns of frontier violence. The defendant's systematic approach to murder and his commercial exploitation of human remains represent criminal behavior that challenges existing legal frameworks and requires innovative judicial responses. The judge's analysis revealed the inadequacy of existing territorial statutes for addressing crimes that combined systematic murder with commercial exploitation of human remains. Current laws focus primarily on individual acts of violence, rather than systematic criminal enterprises that treat murder as a routine business operation. The defendant's crimes require legal innovations that reflect the organized and commercial nature of his criminal activities. Judge Crawford's legal opinion established important precedents for addressing systematic criminal behavior that exploited the unique conditions of frontier life. While the isolated nature of frontier settlements creates opportunities for criminal activity that would be impossible in more populated areas, these circumstances cannot excuse or mitigate crimes that treat human beings as commercial inventory to be harvested and distributed according to market demand. The trial testimony revealed the full extent of Grimm's criminal network and the systematic methods he had used to avoid detection while conducting his operations. Evidence presented during the proceedings demonstrated that the defendant had established business relationships with clients throughout the region who provided steady demand for the biological materials he obtained through systematic murder. The prosecution's presentation of evidence revealed both the scope of Grimm's crimes and the sophisticated methods he had developed for maintaining his operation while avoiding official attention. The defendant's enterprise combined the appearance of legitimate business activities with systematic murder in ways that enabled him to conduct criminal operations for years without arousing suspicion from territorial authorities. Witness testimony from survivors like Marcus Thompson provided crucial evidence about Grimm's methods and motivations. The defendant's systematic approach to victim selection, his preparation of specialized facilities for processing human remains, and his maintenance of detailed records demonstrate that these crimes were not impulsive acts of violence, but carefully planned commercial activities. Defense arguments focused on Grimm's obvious mental illness and his apparent inability to understand the criminal nature of his actions. While there is no question that the defendant committed the acts described in the charges, his psychological condition raises serious questions about his ability to form criminal intent and to understand the moral and legal implications of his behavior. The defense presentation included expert testimony about Grimm's psychological condition and the factors that might have contributed to his criminal behavior. Medical examination reveals profound abnormalities in the defendant's emotional responses and moral reasoning that suggest psychological conditions that may have impaired his ability to distinguish between acceptable and criminal behavior. However, the prosecution successfully argued that Grimm's mental illness, while providing context for his crimes, could not excuse systematic murder regardless of his psychological condition. The defendant's detailed planning, his systematic approach to victim selection and processing, and his successful concealment of his activities for years demonstrate cognitive abilities and awareness that contradict claims of legal insanity. The jury's verdict reflected their recognition that Grimm's crimes, while influenced by psychological abnormalities, represented systematic criminal behavior that required appropriate legal consequences. The systematic nature of the defendant's crimes, the commercial exploitation of his victims, and the threat he poses to public safety require a verdict that prioritizes the protection of innocent travelers and frontier communities. Judge Crawford's sentencing decision balanced recognition of Grimm's mental illness with the necessity of protecting public safety and establishing appropriate consequences for systematic murder. While the defendant's psychological condition provides context for understanding his criminal behavior, the systematic nature of his crimes and the extraordinary threat he poses to public safety require the ultimate penalty. The execution of Silas Grimm in 1875 concluded one of the most disturbing criminal cases in frontier history, but questions about his operation and its implications for frontier safety continued to influence territorial policies and law enforcement practices for years afterward. Federal authorities used the Grimm case to develop improved protocols for monitoring isolated businesses that served frontier travelers. The defendant's ability to conduct systematic criminal activities while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business operations demonstrates the need for enhanced oversight of establishments that serve vulnerable populations, particularly in remote areas where detection and intervention are difficult. The case also influenced territorial policies regarding mental health resources and the identification of individuals whose psychological conditions might create extraordinary dangers for frontier communities. Grimm's case demonstrates that certain forms of mental illness, when combined with criminal opportunity and isolation from social oversight, can create threats to public safety that exceed the capabilities of traditional law enforcement methods. Educational initiatives developed in response to the case emphasize the importance of community awareness regarding warning signs that might indicate similar operations. Travelers and frontier residents must be educated about the indicators of systematic criminal activity and the importance of reporting suspicious circumstances to territorial authorities, even when such reports might seem to be based on speculation rather than concrete evidence. Modern criminal psychology research has identified Grimm's case as an early example of systematic predator behavior that combined apparent business acumen with complete absence of empathy for victims. The defendant's ability to maintain profitable criminal operations while viewing systematic murder as routine commercial activity demonstrates psychological patterns that continue to be relevant to contemporary understanding of organized criminal behavior. The site of the former Crossroads Inn remains abandoned to this day, though local legends and stories continue to circulate about the building's dark history and its lasting effects on the surrounding area. Travelers who pass the location report persistent feelings of unease and foreboding, while some claim to hear unexplained sounds during nighttime hours that suggest the site retains some memory of the horrors that occurred there. Archaeological investigation of the inn site, conducted during the 1950s as part of a broader study of frontier criminal activity, confirmed many details of Marcus Thompson's account and revealed additional evidence of the scope and systematic nature of Grimm's operation. Excavation of the underground chambers uncovered human remains representing at least 37 individuals, confirming the extensive nature of the criminal enterprise and providing some closure for families whose relatives had disappeared while traveling frontier trails. The investigation also revealed construction techniques and specialized equipment that demonstrated the careful planning and criminal expertise behind Grimm's operation. The underground facilities showed evidence of sophisticated knowledge regarding human anatomy, chemical preservation, and the logistics of processing and shipping biological materials across long distances. For those who travel the lonely roads that cross the American West, the story of Silas Grimm and the Crossroads Inn serves as a chilling reminder that the greatest dangers faced by frontier travelers came not from natural hazards or wild animals, but from human predators who used the isolation and desperation of frontier life to acquire victims for purposes that challenged the very definition of civilized behavior. The empty Kansas plains where Grimm once conducted his systematic hunting still echo with the final screams of those who discovered too late that some offers of hospitality come with prices that no honest person should ever be asked to pay. When darkness falls across the prairie and desperate travelers find themselves in need of shelter, the memory of the Crossroads Inn reminds us that not all who offer assistance have benevolent intentions. The next time you find yourself on a lonely road with empty pockets and a hungry belly, remember the lesson of Silas Grimm's terrible inn. When someone offers you hospitality that seems too good to be true, when they smile too widely and ask too many questions about your travel plans, when they suggest that payment can be arranged through means other than money, remember that some debts can only be paid in blood, and some doors, once entered, can never be opened again from the inside. The psychological impact of the Crossroads Inn case extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families to affect the broader frontier community's understanding of trust and hospitality. News of Grimm's systematic crimes spread quickly through the network of travelers, traders, and frontier settlements, creating a climate of suspicion that changed how people interacted with strangers on the frontier trails. The case also revealed the vulnerability of the frontier's informal support systems, which depended heavily on the willingness of established settlers to provide assistance to travelers in distress. Grimm had exploited this tradition of frontier hospitality, using people's expectations of mutual aid to identify and capture victims who had no other options for survival. Federal investigators who studied the case identified several factors that had enabled Grimm's operation to continue undetected for so long. The isolation of frontier communities meant that information about missing persons traveled slowly and often incompletely. Many disappearances were attributed to the normal hazards of frontier travel: Indian attacks, severe weather, accidents, or simple decisions to change destinations without informing others. The transient nature of the frontier population also worked in Grimm's favor. Many of his victims were men traveling alone who had few permanent connections and whose absence might not be noticed for weeks or months. By the time family members or business associates became concerned about missing individuals, any investigation was hindered by the passage of time and the lack of reliable information about the person's last known location. Captain Hayes's investigation revealed that territorial authorities had received scattered reports about unusual activities at the Crossroads Inn over the months preceding Grimm's capture, but these reports had not been compiled into a coherent picture of systematic criminal activity. Different jurisdictions had handled individual complaints separately, preventing anyone from recognizing the pattern of behavior that might have led to earlier intervention. The case highlighted the inadequacy of frontier communication systems for coordinating law enforcement across the vast distances of territorial jurisdiction. Information that might have revealed Grimm's criminal activities was scattered across multiple agencies and geographical regions, with no effective system for sharing intelligence that might identify systematic criminal operations. Federal authorities used the Grimm case to justify expanded investment in territorial law enforcement infrastructure, including improved communication systems, centralized record-keeping, and specialized units trained to investigate complex criminal operations that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. These improvements would prove crucial in addressing other cases of systematic frontier crime in subsequent years. The psychological study of Grimm's case also contributed to early understanding of criminal behavior patterns that would later be recognized as characteristic of serial killers and organized criminal enterprises. His combination of apparent business acumen with complete lack of empathy for victims represented a psychological profile that law enforcement agencies would encounter repeatedly as the frontier gradually gave way to more settled communities. Dr. Walsh's continued study of the case led him to publish one of the first academic papers on what would later be called psychopathic personality disorder. His analysis of Grimm's behavior patterns and psychological characteristics provided important insights into the identification and management of individuals whose mental conditions created extraordinary dangers for civilian populations. The physician's work on the case also influenced the development of forensic medicine as a specialized field of medical practice. The techniques he developed for analyzing physical evidence from Grimm's underground chambers were adapted and refined for use in other criminal investigations, contributing to the evolution of modern forensic science. Educational programs developed in response to the case emphasized the importance of community vigilance and the need for frontier residents to maintain awareness of potential threats while preserving the traditions of mutual assistance that were essential for survival in remote areas. These programs attempted to balance legitimate security concerns with the preservation of social cooperation that frontier communities required. The case influenced the development of professional organizations for frontier innkeepers and other businesses that served travelers, with new standards and oversight mechanisms designed to prevent similar criminal operations. These professional associations provided frameworks for monitoring business practices and reporting suspicious activities that might indicate criminal behavior. Legal precedents established by Grimm's prosecution influenced the development of territorial and state criminal codes for decades afterward. The case established important principles regarding jurisdiction over crimes that involved multiple territories, the admissibility of physical evidence recovered from crime scenes, and the legal standards for determining criminal responsibility in cases involving defendants with apparent mental illness. The testimony of survivors like Marcus Thompson was also used to develop improved training programs for military personnel and law enforcement officers who might encounter similar criminal operations. Thompson's account of his escape and his analysis of Grimm's methods became part of standard curriculum for frontier law enforcement training. Modern historians who have studied the case note its significance not only as an example of frontier criminal activity, but as an illustration of the social and economic conditions that made such crimes possible. The combination of isolation, economic desperation, and limited law enforcement created opportunities for systematic predation that would have been much more difficult to maintain in more settled regions. The case has also been studied by researchers interested in the psychology of extreme criminal behavior and the social conditions that enable individuals with severe mental illness to commit systematic crimes over extended periods. Grimm's ability to maintain a facade of normal business operations while conducting systematic murder provides insights into the camouflage techniques used by organized criminals. Archaeological work at the Inn site has continued sporadically over the decades, with each new investigation revealing additional details about the scope and methods of Grimm's operation. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 1980s identified additional burial sites that had not been discovered during the original investigation, suggesting that the total number of victims may have been higher than initially estimated. Chemical analysis of soil samples from the site has revealed evidence of preservation techniques and disposal methods that demonstrate Grimm's sophisticated understanding of anatomy and chemistry. The residues found in the underground chambers indicate the use of chemical compounds that would not become widely available until years after Grimm's execution, raising questions about his sources of supply and possible connections to educated accomplices. Recent DNA analysis of human remains recovered from the site has enabled identification of several victims whose families had never learned their fate. These identifications have provided closure for descendant families, while revealing additional details about Grimm's victim selection methods and the geographical range of his hunting activities. The site itself remains under federal protection as both a historical preserve and an active research location. Access is restricted due to safety concerns related to the chemical contamination of the underground chambers, but educational programs provide opportunities for researchers and students to learn about the case and its implications for understanding systematic criminal behavior. Memorial services held at the site have brought together descendant families of Grimm's victims and representatives of frontier historical societies to honor the memory of those who died at the Crossroads Inn. These commemorative events emphasize the importance of remembering the individual human cost of systematic criminal activity and the need for continued vigilance against similar threats. The story of Silas Grimm and the Crossroads Inn has also entered frontier folklore, with numerous embellished accounts and legends that sometimes obscure the historical facts of the case. These folk versions of the story often emphasize supernatural elements and moral lessons, reflecting the profound impact the case had on frontier communities' understanding of evil and the dangers that could lurk behind facades of respectability. Contemporary true crime researchers who have studied the case note its significance as one of the earliest documented examples of systematic commercial murder in American criminal history. The combination of systematic victim selection, sophisticated processing methods, and organized distribution networks represents a level of criminal organization that prefigured later developments in organized crime. The case has also been analyzed by researchers studying the economics of frontier crime and the market conditions that enabled criminal enterprises like Grimm's operation. The demand for human biological specimens from medical institutions and private collectors created economic incentives for systematic murder that would have been absent in other contexts. For modern travelers who cross the American West on highways that follow routes similar to the old frontier trails, the story of the Crossroads Inn serves as a reminder of the human cost of westward expansion and the dangers faced by those who sought their fortunes in the frontier territories. Many of the remote locations that once harbored criminal operations like Grimm's have been transformed by modern development, but the lessons of vigilance and community cooperation remain relevant. The case continues to influence contemporary discussions about public safety and the identification of systematic criminal operations. Law enforcement agencies study Grimm's methods as examples of how criminals exploit social vulnerabilities and institutional limitations to conduct systematic predation while avoiding detection. Educational institutions throughout the former frontier region have incorporated the Crossroads Inn case into curricula that examine the social history of the American West and the development of criminal justice systems. These programs emphasize the importance of understanding how social and economic conditions can create opportunities for systematic criminal activity and the role of community vigilance in preventing similar crimes. The legacy of Silas Grimm's crimes extends beyond their immediate historical context to provide insights into the ongoing challenges of identifying and stopping systematic predators who use legitimate business operations to camouflage criminal activities. The methods he developed for victim selection, processing, and disposal continue to inform contemporary understanding of organized criminal behavior. In the end, the story of the Crossroads Inn stands as a testament to both the darkest possibilities of human nature and the importance of social institutions that protect vulnerable populations from exploitation. Grimm's systematic predation was enabled by the absence of effective oversight and communication systems, while his eventual capture and punishment demonstrated the power of community cooperation and professional law enforcement working together. For those who study the case today, the most chilling aspect may not be the extent of Grimm's individual crimes, but the recognition that the social and economic conditions that enabled his operation could potentially emerge again in different contexts, where isolation, desperation, and inadequate oversight create opportunities for systematic predation. The empty Kansas landscape where the Crossroads Inn once stood continues to remind us that civilization is maintained through constant vigilance and mutual cooperation, and that the failure of these social bonds can create spaces where evil flourishes unchecked. The travelers who trusted Silas Grimm's hospitality paid the ultimate price for their faith in human decency. But their sacrifice was not in vain, if it teaches future generations to recognize and resist the predators who would exploit our basic human needs for shelter, sustenance, and companionship. In the Wild West, survival often depended on a man's ability to recognize danger before it was too late to escape. The travelers who ignored their instincts and trusted Silas Grimm's cold hospitality learned too late that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one who greets you with a smile and promises that everything will work out just fine if you'll only step inside and make yourself comfortable. The inn seeking shelter only to discover they lacked the funds to pay for room and board. That's when Silas Grimm would flash that cold smile and make his terrible offer: work off the debt through special services that were never clearly explained until it was too late to refuse. Marcus Thompson was one of the few men who lived to tell about Grimm's proposition. A former cavalry soldier trying to make his way to California, Thompson arrived at the inn in late 1873 with nothing but the clothes on his back and a hungry belly. His account, given to territorial authorities months later, provides our most detailed look at how Grimm operated. "I'd been riding for 3 days without proper food when I saw those oil lamps burning like beacons in the darkness. The innkeeper was waiting on the porch as if he'd been expecting me, though I'd made no reservation. When I explained my situation, that I was broke but desperate for shelter, his whole demeanor changed. The fake courtesy dropped away, and something predatory took its place." Thompson's testimony reveals the calculated nature of Grimm's approach. "He looked me up and down like a rancher evaluating livestock, paying particular attention to my physical condition and the calluses on my hands. Then he made his offer: room, board, and even a few dollars in spending money, all in exchange for helping with some special projects around the property." The former soldier's military training made him suspicious of offers that seemed too good to be true. "Something about the way he said special projects made my skin crawl, but I was desperate enough to consider anything that didn't involve breaking the law. He assured me the work was perfectly legal, just labor that required discretion due to the sensitive nature of his business operations." Thompson's account reveals how Grimm used desperation to cloud his victim's judgment. "I asked for details about the work, but he said those would be explained after I'd committed to staying. The room he offered was comfortable enough: clean sheets, warm blankets, and a window that looked out over the prairie. But the window had bars on the inside, disguised as decorative ironwork. The soldier's testimony becomes more chilling as he describes his first night at the inn. I woke around midnight to the sound of digging from somewhere below my room. The scraping of shovels against earth was unmistakable, mixed with voices too low to make out words. When I tried to look out the window, I saw lantern light moving around those rectangular plots Dr. Walsh had noticed. Thompson's military experience told him he was in danger. I'd learned to trust my instincts during the war, and every instinct was screaming at me to get out of that place. But when I tried the door, I discovered it was locked from the outside. The decorative ironwork on the window was solid steel, and the glass was too thick to break quietly. The former cavalry soldier's escape attempt reveals more about the inn's sinister purpose. I managed to pry up some loose floorboards and discovered a cellar space beneath my room. The smell that rose from below was like nothing I'd ever experienced, a mixture of decay, chemicals, and something else I couldn't identify. But what I saw down there made me understand why travelers who stayed at the Crossroads Inn were never seen again. Thompson's testimony about what he found in the cellar was so disturbing that territorial authorities initially refused to believe it. The cellar had been divided into chambers connected by narrow passages. Some rooms contained workbenches with tools that belonged in a butcher shop rather than an inn. Others held large vats filled with chemicals that burned the nostrils and made the eyes water. But the worst chamber contained evidence of Grimm's real business. The soldier's description of that final chamber provides crucial evidence about the fate of previous guests. Metal tables stained with substances I didn't want to identify, restraints designed to hold a human body motionless, and surgical instruments that had obviously seen recent use. On shelves along the walls were glass jars containing specimens that had once been parts of human beings. Thompson's testimony reveals the systematic nature of Grimm's operation. I found records documenting dozens of previous guests, with detailed notes about their physical characteristics, health conditions, and the specific uses their bodies had been put to after their deaths. Grimm wasn't just killing travelers, he was harvesting them for purposes I couldn't fully comprehend. The former soldier's escape was only possible because his military training had prepared him for exactly this kind of situation. I'd learned to pick locks during reconnaissance missions, and the cellar door wasn't designed to keep out someone with proper skills. But getting out of the building was only the beginning. I still had to cross 60 miles of open prairie with a madman who knew the territory better than I did. Thompson's harrowing flight from the inn provides insight into Grimm's hunting methods. I hadn't gone 10 miles before I heard hoofbeats behind me. Grimm was coming after me personally, and he brought help, men whose laughter carried across the prairie like the howling of wolves. They hunted me like sport, driving me toward box canyons and dead-end trails where escape would be impossible. The chase lasted 3 days, with Thompson using every survival skill he'd learned during the war to stay ahead of his pursuers. They knew the country too well for me to outrun them directly, so I had to be smarter. I doubled back on my own trail, hid in creek beds during daylight, and used every trick I could remember about moving through hostile territory. Thompson's eventual escape was only possible because he encountered a cavalry patrol that had been sent to investigate reports of missing travelers in the region. I was more dead than alive when Sergeant Miller found me hiding in a buffalo wallow, but I managed to convince him and his men that the Crossroads Inn was more than just another frontier establishment. The cavalry investigation that followed Thompson's report uncovered evidence of crimes that shocked even hardened frontier soldiers. Captain William Hayes, who led the investigation, filed reports that were immediately classified by territorial authorities who deemed the contents too disturbing for public knowledge. Captain Hayes's classified report, not released until 1923, reveals the full extent of Grimm's operation. The Crossroads Inn served as the center of a commercial enterprise that exploited the desperate circumstances of frontier travel to acquire human subjects for purposes that exceeded the boundaries of civilized understanding. The captain's investigation revealed the systematic nature of Grimm's crimes. Evidence recovered from the premises indicates that over the course of 3 years, approximately 47 individuals had been processed through the facility's underground chambers. The victims were selected based on specific criteria including physical condition, lack of family connections, and travel circumstances that made their disappearance unlikely to prompt immediate investigation. Hayes's report documents the sophisticated methods Grimm had developed for his operation. The inn's location and legitimate business operations provided perfect cover for identifying and acquiring suitable subjects. Travelers who arrived with adequate funds were served normally and sent on their way, while those in desperate circumstances were evaluated for other purposes. The investigation revealed that Grimm's operation extended beyond simple murder to include systematic harvesting of human remains for commercial purposes. The recovered documentation indicates that various organs, tissues, and other biological materials were preserved and shipped to clients throughout the frontier region. The demand for such materials appears to have been sufficient to sustain a profitable criminal enterprise. Captain Hayes's report includes disturbing details about Grimm's preservation and shipping methods. The cellar facilities included sophisticated equipment for chemical preservation and specialized containers for transporting delicate biological specimens across long distances. The operation demonstrated knowledge of anatomy and chemistry that suggested medical training or consultation with educated accomplices. The captain's investigation revealed the extent of Grimm's customer network. Correspondence recovered from the premises indicates regular business relationships with individuals in Denver, Kansas City, St. Louis, and several other cities. The nature of these relationships suggests that demand for Grimm's products extended throughout the frontier region and beyond. Hayes documented the systematic way in which Grimm had avoided detection while conducting his crimes. The inn's isolated location and legitimate business operations provided effective cover for illegal activities, while careful victim selection ensured that disappearances were unlikely to prompt coordinated investigation. The operation demonstrated sophisticated understanding of frontier law enforcement limitations. The investigation also revealed Grimm's elaborate disposal methods for evidence and waste materials. Behind the inn, investigators discovered multiple burial sites containing remains that could not be commercially utilized. These graves were arranged in the rectangular patterns Dr. Walsh had observed, with each site carefully mapped and documented in Grimm's records. Captain Hayes's report reveals the psychological profile of a systematic predator who combined business acumen with complete disregard for human life. Grimm's documentation reveals a methodical approach to criminal activity that treated human beings as commercial inventory to be processed and distributed according to market demand. The capture of Silas Grimm proved more challenging than territorial authorities had anticipated. When the cavalry patrol arrived at the Crossroads Inn to arrest him, they found the building apparently abandoned, with no sign of the proprietor or evidence of recent occupation. However, the inn's abandonment was revealed to be an elaborate deception when soldiers conducting a thorough search discovered Grimm hiding in a concealed chamber beneath the cellar. His capture led to the recovery of additional evidence that confirmed the systematic nature of his crimes. Grimm's arrest revealed the extent to which his operation had been prepared for the possibility of discovery. The concealed chamber contained supplies and equipment that would have enabled extended hiding, along with additional records documenting criminal activities that had not been discovered during the initial investigation. The prisoner's psychological evaluation revealed characteristics that made him unlike typical frontier criminals. Grimm displayed no remorse for his actions and spoke of his victims as commercial inventory that had been processed according to business necessity. His complete lack of empathy suggested psychological abnormalities that exceeded normal criminal behavior. Dr. Walsh, who had narrowly escaped becoming one of Grimm's victims, was called upon to evaluate the prisoner's mental condition. During my examination, Grimm spoke freely about his methods and motivations, displaying pride in the efficiency of his operation and regret only that circumstances had forced him to abandon a profitable enterprise. The physician's evaluation revealed Grimm's view of his crimes as legitimate business activities. He expressed genuine puzzlement at society's negative reaction to his work, claiming that he had provided valuable services to clients who appreciated quality biological materials. His inability to recognize the moral implications of his actions suggested profound psychological abnormalities. Dr. Walsh's examination also revealed Grimm's apparent lack of normal human emotional responses. Throughout our conversations, he displayed no anxiety about his legal situation, no concern for his victims, and no regret for the suffering he had caused. His emotional flatness was so complete that I questioned whether he possessed normal human consciousness. The legal proceedings that followed Grimm's capture were complicated by questions about his mental competency and the unprecedented nature of his crimes. Territorial courts had no experience with cases involving systematic murder for commercial purposes, creating procedural challenges that influenced frontier legal development. Judge Samuel Crawford, who presided over the proceedings, noted that Grimm's case raised fundamental questions about criminal motivation and the appropriate legal response to crimes that exceeded normal patterns of frontier violence. The defendant's systematic approach to murder and his commercial exploitation of human remains represent criminal behavior that challenges existing legal frameworks. The judge's analysis revealed the inadequacy of territorial statutes for addressing crimes that combined systematic murder with commercial exploitation of human remains. Existing laws focus on individual acts of violence rather than systematic criminal enterprises that treat murder as a business operation. The defendant's crimes require legal innovations that reflect the organized nature of his criminal activities. Judge Crawford's legal opinion established important precedents for addressing systematic criminal behavior that exploited frontier conditions. While the isolated nature of frontier life creates opportunities for criminal activity, it cannot excuse systematic predation that treats human beings as commercial inventory to be harvested and distributed according to market demand. The trial testimony revealed the full extent of Grimm's criminal network and the systematic nature of his operation. Evidence presented during proceedings demonstrated that the defendant had established relationships with clients throughout the region who provided steady demand for the biological materials he harvested from murdered victims. The prosecution's presentation of evidence revealed both the scope of Grimm's crimes and the sophisticated methods he had developed for avoiding detection. The defendant's operation combined legitimate business activities with systematic murder in ways that enabled him to conduct criminal activities for years without arousing official suspicion. Defense arguments focused on Grimm's obvious mental illness and his apparent inability to understand the criminal nature of his actions. While the defendant clearly committed the acts described in the charges, his psychological condition raises questions about his ability to form criminal intent and understand the moral implications of his behavior. The jury's verdict reflected their recognition that Grimm's mental illness, while providing explanation for his crimes, could not excuse systematic murder regardless of the defendant's psychological condition. The systematic nature of the defendant's crimes and the commercial exploitation of his victims require consequences that reflect the organized nature of his criminal enterprise. Judge Crawford's sentencing decision balanced recognition of Grimm's mental illness with the necessity of protecting public safety and establishing appropriate consequences for systematic murder. While the defendant's psychological condition provides context for his criminal behavior, the systematic nature of his crimes requires the ultimate penalty to prevent similar future offenses. The execution of Silas Grimm in 1875 concluded one of the most disturbing criminal cases in frontier history, but questions about his operation and its implications for frontier safety continued to influence territorial policies for years afterward. Federal authorities used the Grimm case to develop improved protocols for monitoring isolated businesses that served frontier travelers. The defendant's ability to conduct systematic criminal activities while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business operations demonstrates the need for enhanced oversight of establishments that serve vulnerable populations. The case also influenced territorial policies regarding mental health resources and the identification of individuals whose psychological conditions might create dangers for frontier communities. Grimm's case demonstrates that mental illness combined with criminal opportunity can create extraordinary dangers for civilian populations, particularly in isolated areas where detection and intervention are difficult. Modern criminal psychology research has identified Grimm's case as an early example of systematic predator behavior that combined business acumen with complete lack of empathy for victims. The defendant's ability to maintain profitable criminal operations while viewing murder as routine business activity demonstrates psychological abnormalities that created exceptional dangers for frontier travelers. The site of the former Crossroads Inn remains abandoned to this day, though local legends claim that the building's evil history has left permanent marks on the location. Travelers who passed the site report unexplained feelings of dread and unease, while some claim to hear sounds of digging during nighttime hours. Archaeological investigation of the inn site, conducted in the 1950s, confirmed the existence of the underground chambers Marcus Thompson had described and revealed evidence of Grimm's systematic criminal activities. Excavation of the site uncovered remains of at least 37 individuals, confirming the scope of the criminal operation and providing closure for families whose relatives had disappeared while traveling frontier trails. The investigation also revealed construction techniques and equipment that demonstrated Grimm's sophisticated approach to his criminal enterprise. The underground facilities showed evidence of careful planning and specialized knowledge that enabled efficient processing and preservation of biological materials for commercial distribution. For those who travel the lonely roads of the American West, the story of Silas Grimm and the Crossroads Inn serves as a chilling reminder that the greatest dangers on the frontier came not from wild animals or hostile weather, but from human predators who used isolation and desperation to acquire victims for purposes that challenged the very definition of civilized behavior. The empty plains where Grimm once hunted still echo with the screams of those who discovered too late that some debts can only be paid in blood. When darkness falls across the prairie and you find yourself desperate for shelter, remember that not all who offer help have your best interests at heart. Sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one who greets you with a smile and promises that everything will be just fine if you'll only step inside and make yourself comfortable. The next time you see a lonely light burning in the window of an isolated inn, ask yourself if you're willing to pay the price that might be demanded. Because in the Wild West, hospitality often came with a cost that no honest person should ever have to pay.